Okay, welcome everyone to the second Cyber Ireland South Chapter meeting. I hope you enjoyed your bank holiday weekend and have explored the 2-kilometre radius to the maximum at this stage. We got a bit of good news, I suppose. We can travel up to 5 kilometres from home now, so God knows what adventures we'll get up to by the next bank holiday. The government announced on Friday a roadmap for reopening society and businesses from the 18th of May in a 5-phase process. So I suppose what might be of interest is what are the implications and security challenges of planning for a return to work and economic activity for businesses, both large and small, around the country. This morning, we have a very interesting panel to discuss the security challenges of COVID-19, organised by the Cyber Ireland South Chapter. So the South Chapter and the regional chapters of Cyber Ireland in general provide a link between the national activities and the regional members. The regional chapters organise a regular meetup for the cybersecurity community in the region, whether that be face-to-face or online meeting as we have today, to include talks on thought leadership, cybersecurity topics, trends and applications, but also to raise awareness of Cyber Ireland's activities at the national level and gain buy-in regionally, so from a top-down perspective. And then for the regions also to identify their own strengths in particular domains of cybersecurity and identify particular regional challenges and develop initiatives relevant to each region, so a bottom-up approach, which in turn feeds into the national level where we have a collective voice to represent the cybersecurity sector in Ireland. So the South Chapter kicked off its first meeting in February on February the 28th in the architecturally impressive number 1 Largescale in Cork, where we had Richard Brown, the Director of the National Cybersecurity Centre, discuss Ireland's national cybersecurity strategy and also the role of the NCSC. We had a very good event, over 80 people attended, and the survey that we ran afterwards provided an overview of the topics of interest for the South Chapter and also a list of speakers that would be able to speak at upcoming events as well. So there were also a number of people who put themselves forward to be organisers or chapter leads for the South Chapter. And then there was also some people who didn't run fast enough when I approached them. So the leaders for the South Chapter, just to introduce them, they are Don Sheehan, Managing Director at CyberPass, Paul Ryan, Senior Director, Engineering Operations at Qualcomm, Ger Teahan, Director, Digital Security and Cyber Solutions at Johnson Controls, Louise McIndoe, SOC Operations Manager, JRI America, and Emer O'Neill, Global Security Response Senior Manager at VMware. So the South Chapter leads have put together a very interesting panel on this topic this morning. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ger Teahan, who's the moderator for this morning's panel. Just to note that we would like this to be an interactive session. So there's an opportunity to have your input, to ask the panel questions as we go along by using the Q&A feed by clicking on that icon there. Ger, I'm going to pass it over to you. Hi, Ger, you're on mute there.
Thanks, Owen. So, good morning, everybody. Good to see everybody. Such a large audience for our webinar this morning. I guess the format of the webinar is to gather a good broad spectrum of leadership in cyber and digital security, and take a format where we, we don't use, we're not going to use PowerPoint. It's going to be pretty interactive. You have an opportunity to bring in questions into us and really, leverage the experience of the panel in terms of cyber architecture, running large operations. One point of housekeeping, Patrick couldn't make it this morning, so we're going to potentially finish on the hour. But let's see how the Q&A goes. We're very open to having an interactive session as much as we can in this format, and make the most of it this morning. So with that, I think we should move into the first set of questions. And I thought it would be useful to start from the perspective of senior management running a large operation in Ireland. So just to give you a quick introduction to the panel attendees. So Donal Sullivan, VP and General Manager, Johnson Controls, managing a large operation, developing next generation digital security applications. Ger McNamara, Director in Digital Solutions in Johnson Controls. Damien Moran, Senior Director of Security Operations for GRI America. Syed Mahmood, who is Principal Security Architect in BT Global Services, and myself, Jerry, Director of Digital Solutions in Johnson Controls. So with that, I would open the first question to Donal. From your perspective, Donal, as a senior manager running a very large operation in Ireland, and at relatively short notice for everybody, we've all had to do this pivot to remote operations. What from your experience has that been, and how do you describe that experience in terms of actually managing that pivot to remote operations whilst at the same time keep the business running?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Jerry. So look, for us, like everybody else, it was short notice. I would say we were helped by our own, workforce, who were really, I think, very au fait with the facts, very technically savvy, which helped, and anticipating that a move like that was going to come, that we were going to have to look at remote working. And so it was not a job of persuasion, it was one of just seeing how quickly we could facilitate. I guess we don't have a manufacturing operation, it's office-based environment, so that simplified it somewhat. But still, it was a complex move to get everybody remote working quickly, and to do that in a secure manner, to get sufficient VPN access for everybody. Looking at all the equipment that people would need and how we would make sure that they could be productive at home. And then with the sort of workforce that we have, not everybody has ideal working at home conditions. Some are in shared living, small apartments, etc., where you don't have a dedicated workspace, maybe you don't have an office. And then the complexity of managing young children, perhaps you've got other relatives that are living with you through the pandemic. So lots of complexities around people's individual circumstances that we had to manage. But we've been as flexible as possible with people as we've gone through that. And I have to say the response of employees, and it's not just us, I'm sure anyone that I'm speaking to is the same, has been fantastic. So people have gone along with it wholeheartedly, and from that perspective it was made easy, technically more complex. And then the other thing that we see, I guess, is there is a productivity impact, and because with the best will in the world, and people are using all the best technology that's available, from things like Teams that were on this morning, Zoom, various other collaboration tools, etc. There's nothing quite like being able to get a number of people in a room if you've got a difficult problem that you're trying to tackle. And so there are layers that kind of impede your progress. And then also just the working conditions that people are challenged with as well, particularly if you're trying to mind and manage children or educate children as you're working, is a tough thing to juggle. So we've worked our way through that as well, and we found at this point that we're working, I would say, pretty effectively, not the same as being in the office. And so for us, that's something that we look forward to, is getting back to our office environment and having people on site as soon as that's safe to do so. And that looks like that'll be a little time away. So we're now into detailed planning of how we get back to some sort of normal over a period of time, and lots of detailed planning going into that, Jerry.
Thanks, Donal. Yeah, it's certainly been an experience to shift to this big pivot to remote working, and it's not just technology. It's having the right environment at home so that you can be effective, and that's different circumstances for different employees. So it's definitely been a learning phase that we've all had to go through. I guess what I'd like to do now is maybe come to yourself, Sid, and discuss, in your experience, you're working with a lot of very large enterprises and helping them to manage this pivot. And there's some of the discussions we've had, Sid, around the impact of this very large shift, almost with a couple of days' notice, to large-scale remote operations. And in our discussions, you talked about large companies looking to increase remote access to their environments. But there's a lot more to it than that, Said, isn't there? There's a lot more than just beefing up bandwidth on VPN. What were the other type of knock-on cyber-related, network-related things that people had to think about?
It's actually been a very fascinating journey, Jerry, working with some of the customers and their assumptions that they've got a remote access capability they could expand quite easily. A lot of them went down the route of buying additional licenses just to enable workforces, but didn't necessarily look at the full impact of scaling from 1,000-2,000 users to 10,000 to 15,000 users that had to remote work. So it wasn't just licensing that had to be considered; it had to be also looked at in terms of bandwidth, platform capacity, scale of operations in terms of where people are logging in from. I mean, some of the customers I work with have global locations, UK, Ireland, US, Far East, etc., and they have different deployments at different zones. So you have to look at the entire end-to-end model when you're looking at the capacity, performance, etc. The other aspects we've also had to be able to consider is resilience. How resilient are those services? Do they have the availability of internet links that are HA pairs or dispersed deployments where they can actually balance their traffic properly? But it's also fundamental things such as ensuring the platforms they're connecting to have sufficient capacity to actually support the thousands of users that you're expanding to. And when you go on this journey, what looks like an investment in pure licensing terms, it turns out to be quite a large-scale investment in managing that capacity, also upscaling that capacity to support the additional loads, but also making sure you've got the right protection mechanisms in place. So whether it's at your endpoints for protecting your devices that people are taking and using remotely, or the availability of your internet links, whereby you should be looking at protecting those links with DDoS to stop any kind of attacks that may be affecting both your remote users plus your customer base.
Yeah, and Sid, I'm also aware there are companies on the webinar this morning that don't have resources in cyber architects and don't have lots of technical resources. What kind of advice would you give them for managing this environment and potentially planning the phased return to the workplace? Are there best practices that they could do with the limited resources they have, and where could they go for information?
That's a very simple question to ask, Jerry, but an awfully complex one to respond to, because it all depends on the type of company, what they require in terms of access, where their data is located, what their maturity is in terms of their infrastructure. Are they internet connected? Do they have secure VPN access to their organization? So many aspects have to be looked at in terms of the protection of the user, protection of the data, protection of the access. It goes back to those principles of security, of confidentiality, integrity, availability. You have to build those controls from the bottom up and look at how your business is actually going to be utilizing the services it needs, the access it needs, and the applications it needs. So simple things like everything from home security. People especially in the smaller business areas may not be used to working remotely, may not have that sort of mindset to say, well, how do I protect the data I'm looking at from other people looking at it, or protect the appliance that we've got? When we actually start returning to work, how am I going to maintain my safety of the equipment I'm carrying around? It's simple things like that that have to be looked at. But at the same time, some of the fundamental controls are just not being followed, and we've had to educate users about backing up data, having data stored either in cloud or local storage, even a simple USB drive, where you can actually back up your local data in case you have any issues. But you also have to protect that endpoint, the laptop you're connected to, or the iPad, or whatever device it may be, to make sure that you've got the right security controls in place, such as malware detection, a proper firewall, having two-factor authentication for your remote access, a secure VPN. All of that has to be looked at, from an end-to-end perspective.
Yeah. So certainly, there are a set of cyber essentials that every company should have as part of that control framework that you mentioned. So Damien, from your perspective, running large-scale security operations, are there any insights you can share in your experience, and from a SOC perspective, how have you found the shift that's gone on, and what type of experience have you had in this COVID crisis?
Sure, thanks, Jerry. I guess what I would say is that I think a lot of us have been monitoring this threat for a while before it actually ended up with, I suppose, a government lockdown and large scale working from home. So a lot of preparation would have gone in place across the industry, really, in order to make sure that the transition wasn't anything out of the ordinary or unexpected, really. And I think if you're architected correctly to ensure that when people are working remotely, that they have the same level of protection, and from a security operations perspective, that you have the same level of detection and response capability as if they're on site, then the transition won't be too onerous. Now, it's great to have eyesight, or hindsight, I suppose, is 2020. So a lot of organizations won't have been necessarily as well positioned. But what I would say, I suppose, is that in terms of maybe specific technology tool sets, it's the endpoint threat detection response type tools that have really kind of come into their own when you're talking about all of the endpoints that you need to potentially investigate and respond to are in people's homes rather than in the offices. So it has worked pretty well, I suppose, from that perspective. Yep.
Would you have seen a change in the threat actors?
Yeah.
Just in general, would you have seen different levels of activity picking up, just because unfortunately there are bad actors trying to maximize this opportunity?
There are indeed, and I know at the very start we had a lot of questions, I suppose, from senior management, and there was a lot of, I think, chatter really about a great uptick in terms of the level of threat. Now clearly, you have a lot of change in the environment, and there's a lot of upheaval. And there was mixed reports, I think, from various industry sources, about this increased threat level. And I guess what I would have seen, and we've had our kind of threat intelligence function look at this in more depth, as well as what's actually happening out there. And we didn't really discern that there was any particular uptick. Now, clearly, COVID-19 had not existed as a potential news story, and therefore a lure that could be leveraged in terms of malware and phishing attacks previous to the pandemic. And obviously, these threat actors are preying on people's concerns and fear, which is a great motivator when it comes to getting someone to click, let's say, on a link in a phishing email. But in general terms, while the modality of access for our end users has changed, and therefore, tangibly there has to be a shift in certainly your attack surface. The actual threat landscape, I would say, hasn't changed significantly. They're the same threats, likely the same mitigations as we'd have seen before this. You just have there is definitely, obviously, more remote users. And we do see COVID-19 obviously used extensively in terms of phishing attacks, and there's potentially more of a concern from organizations about attacks against their remote access infrastructures. But I would say, other than the shift in your attack surface, because basically you have an awful lot more users out of the office rather than in the office, and therefore on remote access and home Wi-Fi or other connections, there hasn't necessarily been any really significant shift in terms of the threat landscape.
Okay. I think it's probably worth adding to that, though. It depends really massively on the maturity of the organisation, because Damien's absolutely right. For those companies out there, they've got robust, centralised management, got the tools in place for malware detection, etc. That's great. You've got reasonably good protection controls there. You can look at further enhancements in that space. But what I've seen out there is that companies, organisations have literally gone out and bought a laptop from their local retail store and been told, just install this VPN client and connect it, without any of the relevant protections that you would want to have in place. Simple things like your antivirus, your firewall locally, malware detection. And that's left them probably far more exposed to things like phishing attacks, malware attacks, people literally podding and poking whatever they can in that space.
Yeah, I think that's very fair, Sid, as well. It definitely has a huge amount to do with the maturity organization. A lot of organizations will have essentially had no shift in terms of their exposure, because the access and controls that are applicable in the office are the same as out of the office. But absolutely, where you have small or medium-sized enterprises, or simply organizations that perhaps had just not engaged with a remote working model, now have had to shift and pivot very quickly to remote working, with none of the time to architect that securely, none of the time to design in security controls, to go and test and validate that those security controls are effective, that their monitoring is effective. And so those organizations, and where I suppose you have a lot of new infrastructure, that does take time to bed in and really to validate. So I definitely would concur that not all organizations, I suppose, are as lucky. And it does also, I think, have a significant effect based on probably the vertical you're in. So the financial services and banking industry has a lot of regulatory requirements which force it to do extensive amounts of business continuity planning. So, I mean, we had a lot of discussions going on for months about preparatory planning and mitigations in relation to this specific threat. But other organizations may not have been in that position.
Okay, good. So moving on then to, we've done the pivot, and now we're starting to see publication across governments now of the potential phasing of going back to the workplace, or whatever the new normal is going to be. It will certainly be a phased approach. And I think the German Chancellor said, if you thought the pivot was hard, the reopening is going to be much harder. So we've got to try and plan now towards this phasing of coming back to the workplace, or different modes of operation over a period of time where you have both a remote workforce, significant remote workforce, and getting back to the workplace. So I guess what I'd like to do now is maybe come back to Donal and Ger. So Ger McNamara is Director of Digital Solutions, specifically in the area of location services, so location-based services, taking intelligent data-based perspective of the workplace. So Ger, could I come to you and maybe have a discussion on, as we come back now, we have to observe social distancing, contact tracing. I think it's test, trace, track is going to be the new mantra for everybody. So when you think about that from a data point of view, and everything that we see now from discussions on mobile, thermal cameras, and everything in between, what's your perspective on all of that technology, and what can people think about as they try and grasp these challenges around social distancing and contact tracing? What do you see in that space?
Hey, thanks, Jerry. Good morning, everyone. I guess the big challenge is as we return back to work, the social distancing is probably the most important thing to look at, because if you think about running a contact trace, if somebody tests positive, the better you've enforced social distancing, the less of the impact that contact trace will have in your business. In the perfect world, if everybody maintains social distancing, if somebody unfortunately tests positive and comes to work, they will have no impact on anybody else. Now, of course, the reality is it's never going to be like that. We're all humans, nobody's perfect. So really, we've been looking at the data that exists inside buildings, and then how you can augment that to help people with social distancing. We're social creatures. We can come back. There can be nice layouts, stickers on the floor, desks cordoned off, and that all looks good. You might run your office at 30% utilization. You could use your access control system to only allow access to the people who are supposed to be in on that day, or that morning, or that afternoon if you're running shift. And you can also use it to actually do a count of how many people are actually in the building. If your plan is to run up to 30% utilization with a new floor plan, you could use your access control to check that you're not going over those numbers. Now, that in itself doesn't really help you with the social distancing side. So people have been looking at, could we use phones to get a sense of where people are in the building, and are they really maintaining a social distance? The challenge, I think, as other countries have found using phones, and particularly with Bluetooth, is the accuracy. Trying to get down to 2 meters reasonably accurately to understand if somebody's having a prolonged contact or not is really challenging with a phone. They're struggling to do it outdoors, and it becomes even more of a challenge if you're looking to do that inside. Now, we've been looking at different technologies and ways of doing that, and we think the way forward is to have some form of automated social distancing monitoring. And that's just something that can nudge and help employees when they come back. With the best layouts, we haven't tried them out yet. So until people come back in and you can observe how they are working, it's very difficult to know if a particular layout is going to maintain social distancing for you. It may have unintended consequences of driving clusters of people other places inside the building. The other piece people need to think of as well with the social distancing monitoring is people are always thinking about the human to human interaction, which is really important, but you can also have human to space interaction. Somebody could be using a room, could be using a desk for a prolonged period of time. If they have symptoms or they test positive and somebody happens to use that space directly after them, or lots of people use that space directly after them, it's really important to understand how the spaces are actually being used inside. And there's a social distancing style to spaces, but also using that data to drive dynamic cleaning. So the more intensely a space is used, the idea is the more intensely you would actually clean that space. And then finally, as Jerry mentioned, you have to have the ability to run a good detailed contact trace inside your workplace. And I'd recommend that if you have the facility to do that, and there's ways and means of doing it, you don't wait until somebody tests positive to actually run a contact trace. This is where you should be wargaming, doing your scenario planning. Run a contact trace on everybody if you've got the facility and the tools to do it, and do that every couple of days and see how your profile is changing inside the building, because how well you're social distancing will also factor into what comes out of the actual contact tracing reports. We've done some of this for customers, and it's quite fascinating to look and see the potential for impact if somebody was to test positive early on in the process. And you can use that to dynamically change how you're laying out your workspace.
Very good, Chair. Yeah, no, it's there's definitely a lot of potential for technology to help us with these challenges of getting back to the workplace. We're seeing a lot of governments coming up with their own contact tracing applications, and everybody is really focused on this R number from a national level. But when we get down into micro environments, which is the workplace, we do need to think about what we can do with technology to help us manage the workplace as we try and get back into some kind of new normal. I guess then maybe before I go to some questions, and we are starting to see some questions coming in, I think, Donal, which is good. Maybe Donal, I could just come back around now to yourself again, as we look to go back now, and Ger mentioned some of the initiatives, the distancing, social distancing initiatives. When you think about the workplace, what do you see in terms of things that are practical for people to think about now in terms of their environment? What can they do now to start thinking about phasing back in to the environment that they came from?
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. Good question. So look, I think for most organizations, ourselves included, it becomes a significant health and safety question, and you want to protect your employee base to the maximum possible, and certainly that's our intent. So there's a few critical steps that I think everybody is contemplating. One is, how do you comply with the guidelines that come from government? And that's really around your movement and what's an essential worker, what's an essential task that you have to do, and where do you do those tasks. Luckily for us, we're considered an essential service provider because we keep hospitals, farmer plants, etc. functioning. So that helps us somewhat. At least it helps us with our field service workforce. But our office-bound people, those lines are not so clear-cut as to what's essential and what must be done on-site versus done remotely. I guess we'll take a conservative approach, which is that we will certainly do as much remotely as we can, and only those things that are critical and must happen in location are the things that we'll bring back on-site. But we will do that absolutely in lockstep with the government guidelines as they come along. And then the second approach that we will certainly take is that we will take a data-driven approach. We can do the simple stuff that I think, again, most people will contemplate, which is risk assessing what your environment looks like, putting adequate signage, blocking off certain spaces, trying to have kind of hard barriers that will enforce distancing between employees. But human beings will find creative ways of getting around that. And I think what you want to have is a data-driven approach along the lines that Ger McNamara was explaining. I think they're the kind of things that we will do, so that we've got data that allows us to understand how many people, where they are, who they meet, who might be exposed. We can do scenario planning, we can do risk assessments, we can quickly target cleaning, isolate people, etc. And we do that because it will help us in the long run. We're convinced, as people see that we're taking those extreme measures to protect their health and safety, and we'll be seen as an employer that's going the extra mile to make sure that that's the case. But I think that becomes a significant confidence builder amongst the workforce, and certainly the appetite of our employees around those sorts of measures I think is significant. And these are things that can be done relatively easily. So they're the kind of things that we're thinking about. It's a multi-layered approach. It's going to be simple things, signage, communication, etc. that you would expect. Also technology, and then doing it in phases along a kind of critical path. For us, everybody's talking about the new normal, that there'll be significant remote working into the future. I'm not so sure myself. I think our new normal is to get back to where we were if we could. I think there will be a long transition phase to get to there, and there will be more remote working along the way. But certainly in the polling that we're doing amongst our staff, I think most people would like to be back in their normal work environment for the most part, because that the social element, because of the ease of working with colleagues, the speed of being able to do some of those things, and just the complexity of trying to manage work-life balance, etc. At home. So we'll see what new normal looks like. In the short term, it is going to be a very mixed sort of environment for sure, and I'm not sure how long that goes on for, but the data will help us, and we will build up that profile over time and prove that we've got the best approach that we can do to managing people's health and safety. And once that's done in a very open and transparent way, actually what you find is that the employees really self-monitor, self-maintain that data set themselves, and they're the most enthusiastic, I would say, and the most motivated to make sure that it's managed correctly. So it's, from that perspective, it's relatively easy, provided it's open and transparent.
Yeah. Thanks, Donal. I think the last point you made there about being open and transparent, or just looking at the questions that are coming in now, some of them are really focused on, I think, is really a confidence question. A couple of questions on how do we extend contact tracing before you get to work. People are going to be using public transport. And Sarah has asked about, there's a resistance in going back to the office across some of their US offices. I think it's what you said there, Donal. It's, how do you build, we can have the technology, we can manage the cybersecurity infrastructure and have that ready for both modes of operation. But it's, I think, as you said, how do you manage the confidence of people? Because we are seeing a reluctance of people to come back to the new normal because they feel nervous, I think, about coming back into the wider world, which is kind of unbelievable to say after what we've been through. It's understandable to say after what we've been through, but in such a short period of time to have people's mindset change, to be very nervous.
Yeah.
So I think, as you said, being open with the data and showing how you're measuring and maintaining safety will help people get over that confidence factor. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, look, people are naturally reluctant, and there will be, resistance, I would say, for a while, or just, people nervous about doing it, and rightly so. And I don't think you can, you can't push people into uncomfortable positions, and certainly we won't be doing that. I think it is about proving the case over time that you're providing the safest possible environment. And it then becomes a blend of what you can do within your own building or within your own operations to the maximum extent that you can do it, and then understanding people's journey to and from work. And for sure, somebody getting their own car, going from their own home to their office is probably in the short term a safer journey, you might think, than going on public transport. So, people have to juggle and understand those things themselves until, again, confidence builds more generally. I think, you can only control the controllables, I guess, within the environment that you work. I think we're seeing at a population level, as Ger had mentioned, you will see adoption of these apps, etc. Depends on the sign-up level to see how effective they may be. At a population level, I think they can be useful, but in your own work environment, probably not all that useful unless you layer on other sets of data and ways of managing the social distancing and contact tracing and cleaning, etc. But that will come in time. I think as you build a data set that shows that you are doing that to the maximum extent, that you're protecting people effectively, I think confidence will build. And so for us, it'll be managing that slowly, doing it in phases, building that data set, building people's confidence, and over time, I think you'll see it flip back the other way eventually, but that won't happen. It's not going to be flicking a switch. It's going to be a slow progression, but I think that progression will happen. And the more data that you can provide that proves, gives those evidence points that you're doing it in the best possible way, and that people are not becoming sick in your environment, I think that is the thing that will be the proof point that people are looking for, and you will get through it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for that, Donal. A couple of questions coming in, maybe back to Syed. I think, and Damien, we're coming back to this issue of the corporate device being at home now. Some questioners are saying, the corporate device has also become the homeschooling device, and that corporate device, when it comes back into the corporate environment, will it have a security risk because it's been out of the environment for so long, and will need patching, or will all these devices come back together and suddenly you've got a big patching problem? So I guess what we have seen is that, as Donal said earlier, you've got the kids in your home environment. Remote work, everybody was ready for remote working, I think, but remote working plus kids plus family life is a whole other ballgame. And the corporate device has helped with some of the bottlenecks we've heard about with kids on homeschooling. So those devices, as they now come back in and out of the corporate environment, are there things that people should think about those devices now? Should there be an extra level of cybersecurity hygiene needed now as they come back and forth, or should it be seamless?
I think this comes down to, again, the maturity of the organisations that are providing the equipment and also the policies of companies. You know, I mean, typically in the corporate space, Jerry, you'll find that you are not allowed to share your work device with your family. It shouldn't be used for gaming. It shouldn't be used for accessing anything other than work, and there should be a separate device in place. But appreciating the challenges, you know, that everybody's facing today, you know, schools, you know, educational establishments have an obligation to make sure whatever they're providing for study, for remote work, you know, learning, etc., have been tested and have been properly secured. But certainly I wouldn't advocate, you know, downloading games and things for children to use at home on new corporate devices. You know, people should be considering separating that out completely. But again, you know, you mentioned something about patching here. Patching is quite a key activity. A lot of the corporate world has been looking at how can you deliver patches to endpoint devices rather than having to rely on your corporate infrastructure to trombone that traffic in. Is how can you deliver that from the cloud space? And you know, we've certainly worked with organizations where we can effectively split tunnel traffic from corporate to cloud services, which reduces bandwidth considerably. You know, integrating with platforms such as WSUS in Azure, for example, that will actually take a big load off the platforms because it allows you to still test and control what you deliver to your end users. But for people who don't have that maturity, they should absolutely be looking at their Windows Update on their PCs, you know, from their home to get those latest patches, etc. And they should maintain whatever virus they've got to make sure it's a supported version and getting any updates it's doing on a regular basis. But I still harp on about people backing up their data. You know, it's a critical item, especially if you're, you know, a small company, you don't have, you know, corporate enterprise backup procedures for that data that can be stored off securely. Have some form of backup available to you, especially when you consider some of the attacks we've seen recently on organizations with things like ransomware, where that data is effectively being destroyed by somebody encrypting that data. You can't access it unless you pay a penalty for it. So there's lots of things that people should be doing, which they can do without, you know, major overhead, but it has to be thought about very carefully.
Yes, absolutely. So another question that has come in, specifically around collaboration technologies. Somebody has asked, you know, the whole issue of Zoom and issues with breaches in your collaboration technologies. Has that been something that we've just realized in this pandemic, or, you know, security of voice, collaboration, video, online meetings? This is nothing new. So why has this suddenly become such a hot topic now? You know, there have been well-publicized issues with certain platforms.
It's nothing new. Reality is you've had a massive uptake of people using these remote working conferencing type services without really understanding how they should be protecting them and controlling them. I mean, in corporate world, you're told to, you know, put things like a password on a meeting, only share it, you know, with the host, etc. Make sure that whoever's joining that meeting has got an invite. That there are so many simple levels of protection you can apply to things like Teams to make sure that, you know, it's a secure meeting. But the massive uptake on tools like Teams for, you know, home use and everything, people have just been, you know, frankly ignorant of those kind of controls. So leaving meeting IDs in public, you know, allowing people to be able to bomb has been quite commonplace. I know that, you know, the Teams and other, you know, conferencing technologies have put better stringent controls in place, but there is a big difference between the corporate world and the public world using these services. And I think it is quite key that people get educated about using them safely.
Yeah, exactly. Collaboration, you know, collaboration through video now is extending all the way through to multi-party meetings on social media platforms. You've got the well-established enterprise platform. So, you know, people need to just, as you said, decide which platform they're using, and have they implemented security controls in those platforms that they're meeting their requirements. So yeah, I mean, it's nothing new, but the scale of it, obviously in a short period of time, has caused issues to be surfaced. So I think that's a lot of the questions. One question coming for you. Yeah, go ahead, Sid.
I was going to say, I think it's really worth adding here that, you know, when we start, you know, relaxing the rules about people going back to work, we're not saying that COVID is over by any means or stretch. You know, there will still be people getting infected. Companies will need to recognise that their staff, if they do have any kind of infection in the home or, so, you know, in relation, they will still be expected to be quarantined and working from home. You know, whether that's 7 days or 14 days, depending on circumstances, has to be still taken into consideration. But I think also, you know, people are suffering from the wider economic impacts, the logistical impacts, you know, that business is suffering. And it's going to be a balance between trying to get back to a norm of working with also having to deal with the day-to-day issues.
Absolutely. I mean, the new normal is some kind of a hybrid. And as you said, you know, hopefully we've seen the worst of it, but we don't know. There could be more waves. But we've learned a lot, I think, in this instance of some of the challenges from a cybersecurity point of view, and hopefully we'll be more informed for the next one if and when it comes. So I think today, and I think that's most of the questions that have come in. I think today we've had a good roundtable discussion, which is what we wanted to do. We didn't want to use too much PowerPoint. We've gone from, you know, the challenges of managing the pivot, understanding some of the cybersecurity challenges around that pivot, and then starting to think about what is the reopening and what it might look like and the new normal of managing that. And then, as we said, you know, how do we manage in the future this new normal where it will be a mix of remote and phased return to the workplace. So from that perspective, I think we've had a good discussion. I think, Owen, you've mentioned that this will be an ongoing engagement with Cyber Ireland, and we're very happy to have contributed to that today, and hopefully people got good value out of the discussion. So I'll hand it back to yourself, Owen.
Cheers. Thanks very much, Jerry. So thanks to Jerry, the South Chapter leads for putting this webinar together, and in particular our panelists for giving their thoughts and perspectives on the current situation and security challenges in moving back to the workplace. As Jerry said, we'd like to continue this discussion from today, so that there is potential to run further online meetings on this topic if it's of interest to you. Please let us know your feedback, or if there's any specific topics that you'd like to discuss around security challenges in, I suppose, a post-pandemic environment and moving back into the workplace. Just a couple of notes on the Cyber Ireland activities that are ongoing at present. We ran a member survey a couple of weeks ago to understand industry challenges and what our role should be during COVID. The top challenges to come back from that survey were, for the cybersecurity industry, was around the challenges of remote working and management of teams, the reduction in customer demand in the sales pipeline, but also the increase in fraud, cybercrime and cyber attacks. So I suppose our role is to support the sector during this period, and how we're doing that is through continuing on with our current activities and initiatives. One of these is promoting cybersecurity awareness through online capture the flag competition. So we were going to actually run these in person around the country, 3 of them, but we've moved them all online virtually. We're running four of these capture the flag competitions, and they are open to everyone. So whether you're from an IT background, working in security or working in IT or not, you could be a total novice. The first CTF was held last Wednesday, and we had a great turnout for it. I participated in it myself. It was my first CTF, and it was a lot of fun. And I think that the winner from that technical challenge was a team from Fidelity Investments IT department. So what we would love is for Cyber Ireland member companies to submit a team, or possibly even a number of teams from different departments across your organization, as a fun way to promote cybersecurity in your organization, but maybe also as a team building exercise for when staff are working remotely. So the next CTF is on Wednesday, the 12th of May, Wednesday week. Please do join us for that, and there's more information on our website on the event calendar. We've also launched our careers dashboard to promote cybersecurity careers and pathways. So after completing a Capture the Flag challenge, or for those who are interested in a career in cybersecurity, they may be wondering what are the different types of jobs in industry and what courses can lead to these jobs. So we've put together this cyber careers dashboard, which provides all of this information to students and professionals interested in a career in cyber. There's over 120 courses nationwide mapped on this, from apprenticeships, industry certifications and higher education courses across the country and online. We have another section which profiles 52 different cyber roles in the security industry, including technical and non-technical roles. And then the third part of that is a cyber jobs board. So this is a one-stop site for cybersecurity jobs in Ireland to search for open vacancies. And that is open to Cyber Ireland members to post their open cyber roles on. And then we're also looking to continue our regular events and meetups. For example, the South chapter that we have this morning, the West chapter are organising another meetup in May as well. And then we also have our COVID-19 threat landscape webinar next Tuesday, the 12th of May. We have Richard Brown, the director of the NCSE, giving the national perspective. And we also have the McAfee Advanced Threat Research Team giving an international perspective on the COVID-19 threat landscape and also looking to the future. That'll be moderated by Brian Honan. But we are also, I suppose, developing some new initiatives to support the sector during COVID-19, including promoting our members through a brochure of member resources. And also we've opened up an online events calendar for members to publish their webinars online. Last week, we ran a business supports webinar with Enterprise Ireland and IDA Ireland, and that was to provide an overview of COVID-19 supports and all of the other range of grant schemes that may be of interest during this period to both SMEs and multinationals. The webinar was recorded and it'll be posted to our YouTube channel this week, so keep an eye out for that. And then I suppose we're also advocating to government for the needs of the cybersecurity sector. So what we've got in results from that survey, talking to companies, both multinationals and SMEs, we've been relaying that to Enterprise Ireland, IDA and the National Cybersecurity Centre as well. And then finally, I suppose we are looking to see how can the cybersecurity industry play its part in the COVID-19 crisis, and how can we coordinate the cybersecurity industry's response. And many Cyber Ireland members have been in touch with us, responded to our survey and have offered free resources and solutions to businesses. So we're collating these and we're going to send those out to the wider business community. And then we're also talking to government on how industry can support in the case of a serious cyber incident during COVID-19. And again, if there's any way that we can support your company during this period, please do get in contact with us. Thanks to our panel again, and we hope that today's session was of value.